What if all modern survival technologies are just a pale imitation of ancient knowledge? Modern jackets and sleeping bags won't save you when the batteries run out and the gas runs out. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of North America thrived in conditions that we consider extreme, from the icy blizzards of the Great Plains to the deep snows of the subarctic. They didn't just survive in this cold, they lived in warmth, comfort, and plenty, using ingenious techniques. Watch the video to the end to find out how a bag of dried meat could save an entire people and why their shoes were more effective than any modern membrane. I will reveal the best-kept secret of traveling in the snow. Most people perceive snowshoes as a primitive device made of wood and leather. In fact, it is a revolutionary technology based on a deep understanding of physics. It is not just footwear. It is a tool that transforms deep snow from an impassable barrier into a road. The problem they solve is obvious to anyone who has tried to walk through snowdrifts. Deep snow is an energy vampire. Every step is an effort to break through the crust and lift your foot out of a deep hole. For the Cree and Athabascan hunters, whose lives depended on pursuing prey, wasting that much energy was unacceptable. The genius of snowshoes lies not in the materials, but in the principle of weight distribution. A person weighing 70 kilograms exerts enormous pressure on the snow, immediately sinking into it. The same person on snowshoes distributes their weight over a much larger area, allowing them to literally float on the surface of the snow. The design has been refined over centuries. The frames were made from flexible but durable woods such as ash or birch. They were steamed and bent into the desired shape. The frame was then covered with a mesh of rawhide, creating that very buoyancy. This was not a universal technology. There were different types of snowshoes for different conditions. Short and wide models, known as bear paws, were ideal for the dense forests of the Northeast, where maneuverability was required. Long and narrow models, similar to a teardrop, were used on open plains and in the tundra, as they were designed for speed and long distances. Tribes of the Great Plains, such as the Lakota and Cheyenne, did not use them as often in their grasslands. However, they quickly adopted the technology when hunting in snowy areas, such as the Black Hills. This proves that the technology was known and valued even outside the regions where it was vital. If we look at modern aluminum and plastic snowshoes, we see the same shapes. The principles discovered by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago have remained unchanged. Modern trekking models are direct descendants of long snowshoes, and recreational models are descendants of the bear paw. Moving on, snowshoes changed not only the speed, but also the very essence of hunting. People became quiet and light. They could glide across the snow without making a sound and approach their prey unnoticed. This was a decisive advantage that came not from strength, but from ingenuity. This simple principle of physics, understood and applied many centuries ago, allowed people to explore entire continents. It turned winter from a season of survival into a season of opportunity. This is a real technological breakthrough. This simple principle of physics was mastered long ago. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about modern analogues of ancient technologies? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how Stone Age air conditioning worked? The Tepee, the famous dwelling of the peoples of the Great Plains, is an icon of the American West. But its true genius is hidden from view and invisible from the outside. This hack turned a simple cone of animal skins into a highly efficient and comfortable living machine. At first glance, the problem is obvious. If you light a fire inside a conical tent, it should immediately fill with acrid smoke, and the piercing winter winds blowing across the plains should blow out all the heat. However, the inhabitants of the Tepee, such as the Lakota or Cheyenne, lived in warmth and comfort even in severe blizzards. The secret lay in the inner canopy. It was, in essence, a second wall made of skins or fabric. which was attached from the inside to poles and rose to a height of 1.5 to 2 meters. This canopy did not reach the floor, leaving a gap at the bottom. The physics of this device is ingenious. The cold outside air, which inevitably penetrated under the outer covering of the tepee, did not immediately enter the living space. It hit the inner curtain and, being heavier than warm air, rushed upward through the channel between the two walls. This flow of cold air, rising upward, created a powerful and steady draft. It picked up the smoke from the central hearth and, like a chimney, drew it straight up through the smoke vents. As a result, the air inside the tepee remained clean, and the fire burned evenly and brightly. This system had a second, equally important effect: insulation. The air gap between the outer covering and the inner canopy worked in exactly the same way as modern double glazing. It significantly reduced heat loss, maintaining a comfortable temperature inside. People sitting or sleeping inside were completely protected from drafts. The inner canopy blocked any movement of cold air near the floor. In winter, the lower edge of the outer covering was additionally covered with snow, creating an almost airtight seal. Today, this principle of controlled ventilation is used in modern hot tents for winter camping. Manufacturers of high-efficiency wood stoves also use double wall and air supply systems to create clean and hot combustion. This technology proves that comfort was not a luxury for indigenous peoples, but the norm. They did not simply put up with the cold, they engineered their way around it. The tepee was not just a shelter, but a home designed with a deep understanding of the laws of nature. But how did they solve the problem of moisture and heat when it came to clothing? In the next chapter, we'll learn why the best winter footwear had to be breathable. How important do you think it was to control airflow in such a dwelling? What if I told you that the best winter footwear should get wet? This statement sounds absurd to us, who spend a fortune on waterproof membranes. But indigenous peoples, especially in subarctic regions, knew the main secret. In severe frost, the real enemy is not moisture from the outside, but moisture from the inside. The problem is sweat. The human foot secretes a significant amount of moisture. In a waterproof boot, this moisture cannot evaporate. The sock becomes wet, and in sub-zero temperatures, this moisture freezes instantly. A waterproof boot turns into a personal ice coffin for your feet. The solution was completely breathable footwear. Moccasins made of soft, tanned elk or deer leather are not waterproof by nature, nor were they meant to be. Their purpose is to allow moisture to escape unhindered. The real hack was not in the shoes themselves, but in the system. The moccasin was only the outer protective layer. The main thing happened inside. The foot was never worn barefoot. It was wrapped in special insoles that absorbed and removed moisture. Natural hygroscopic materials were used as socks. These could be dry, soft grass, sphagnum moss, or rabbit fur insoles. These materials drew sweat away from the skin, keeping the foot dry. The moccasin allowed this moisture to evaporate through the pores of the skin. In the evening, when the hunter returned to camp, he would remove the wet inserts and dry them by the fire. The moccasins themselves could freeze overnight and become as hard as wood. But it was enough to hold them by the fire for a few minutes to make them soft again. In the morning, a new batch of dry grass was placed inside them. Another unique advantage was flexibility. The soft sole of the moccasin allowed the wearer to feel the ground under the snow. He could step on a branch and pull his foot back in time without breaking it or making a noise. This was critical for silent hunting. Of course, the snow melted on the moccasins, and they became wet. But thanks to the breathable system, this moisture either evaporated or froze on the outside without penetrating the foot. The foot, wrapped in a dry and warm liner, remained safe. This principle is known today as the vapor barrier system, which is used by extreme mountaineers. They put a thin plastic bag on their feet to prevent sweat from penetrating the insulation of the boot. Indigenous peoples implemented the same principle thousands of years ago using grass. This philosophy of moisture management, rather than water blocking, is ingenious. If you learned something new about this technology, please like this video. Want to know the secret that turns deadly cold into a cozy shelter? For peoples of the subarctic forests such as the Cree, getting caught in a blizzard far from camp was deadly dangerous. But they had a trick that allowed them to build a warm shelter in a couple of hours from the most accessible material, snow. It is important to understand that snow, especially loose snow, is one of the best natural insulators. 90% of it consists of air trapped between crystals. It is this trapped air that retains heat. This hack is called a quinz. It is not the same as an igloo, which is built from blocks of compacted snow. A quinzee is built from loose snow, which can be found in any forest. First, a huge pile of snow had to be collected. It was raked into a tall, dense snowdrift, 2 to 3 meters high. The snow was lightly tamped down as it was added. Then came the most important and counterintuitive step. We had to wait. The snow was left alone for about 2 hours. During this time, a process called sintering took place. Under pressure and due to the temperature difference, the snow crystals began to bind together. The loose pile turned into a solid, monolithic structure. Only then could we start digging. The entrance was made as low as possible so that warm air would not escape. Then, from the inside, we carefully shoveled out the snow, creating a hollow space. The science behind this is amazing. The temperature inside a quinzee, even without a fire, just from the heat of the human body, could be 20 to 30 degrees higher than outside. If it was -30 outside, it could be around 0 inside. Modern survival experts still consider this method one of the most reliable. To control the thickness of the walls, they use the stick method. They stick a bunch of sticks into a snowdrift to a depth of 30 centimeters. When a person digging from the inside hits the end of a stick, they know that the wall has reached the desired thickness. But shelter is only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn how they kept the fire going without lighters. Would you take the risk of building such a shelter, knowing that it could save your life? Starting a fire in harsh winter conditions is hard work. Friction-based methods, such as a hand drill or bow drill, require dry wood and a lot of energy. Indigenous peoples understood that it is much easier to preserve a fire than to create one from scratch. This approach was especially important for sedentary groups such as the Iroquois, who lived in their long houses. Each house had several hearths, and keeping the fire going was a collective responsibility. The fire going out was considered a bad omen and a serious domestic problem. The main technique was to create sleeping coals. At night, the smoldering coals from the hearth were carefully covered with a thick layer of ash. This ash isolated the coals from oxygen, preventing them from burning completely, but also preventing them from going out completely. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes and gently blow on the smoldering coals, adding dry tinder. The fire flared up almost instantly. This technique saved a tremendous amount of time and effort that would otherwise have been spent starting a fire from scratch in a cold morning house. For nomadic groups, such as the Plains tribes, the task was more difficult. They carried fire with them when they moved. Special containers made of bison horn or clay vessels were used for this purpose. Slow-burning material, such as dry tinder fungus, was placed inside the container. It could smolder for hours with almost no smoke. Upon arrival at a new location, this smoldering fungus was used as kindling for a new fire. This was not just a technical task, but almost a sacred duty. The person responsible for carrying the fire was sometimes called the firekeeper. Losing the fire on the way was a serious setback for the whole group. In subarctic regions, hunters who went away for several days also carried fire kits with them. These consisted of dry tinder, flint, and steel, and smoldering material wrapped in moss and bark to preserve it on the way. Today, this principle is used in the concept of a campfire. Tourists often carry smoldering coals from one camp to another to save matches. Modern rescue kits also include materials that can smolder for a long time. Thus, fire management was not so much about creating fire as it was about preserving it. It was a continuous process that required planning and foresight. Fire was the heart of the community, and its beating must not be interrupted. What if I told you that everything you believed about healthy food is wrong? We are obsessed with low-fat foods and low-calorie diets. But for the peoples of the Great Plains and the subarctic, survival in winter depended on the exact opposite. They needed a calorie bomb. That bomb was called Pemmican. The word comes from the Cree language and means made fat. It was the perfect, concentrated, long-lasting source of energy. The recipe was simple but labor-intensive. Bison or deer meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over a low fire until crisp. Then this jerky was ground with stones into a fine powder. Melted fat was added to this meat powder, usually in a 1-to-1 ratio. The fat was fuel. It provided the enormous amount of calories needed to keep the body warm in severe cold. Crushed dried berries, such as wild cherries or cranberries, were often added to the mixture. This not only added flavor, but also provided vitamins, preventing scurvy. The mixture was then tightly packed into rawhide bags. The finished pemmican was incredibly dense and could be stored for years. The fat solidified, preserving the meat and preventing it from spoiling. It was a food that did not freeze, was easy to carry, and was ready to eat. Pemmican was indispensable on winter expeditions. It could be eaten cold on the go, or it could be crumbled into a pot of hot water to make a hearty, fatty soup that warmed you from the inside out. Pemmican was so effective that it was adopted by European fur traders and Arctic explorers. Without pemmican, many polar expeditions would have been impossible. It was the real fuel for exploring the continent. This food provided internal warmth. But how did they cope with the biting wind of the Great Plains? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of their wind-proof clothing. Do you think modern humans could survive on such a diet of fat and meat? In winter on the Great Plains or in the Arctic tundra, the enemy was not only what you could feel, but also what you could see. The bright spring sun reflected off the endless snowfields created an unbearable glare. This phenomenon, known as snow blindness, was a serious threat. Snow blindness is essentially a sunburn of the cornea of the eye. It causes severe pain, temporary loss of vision, and renders a person completely helpless. For a hunter or warrior, losing their sight while traveling meant certain death. The solution to this problem was simple and ingenious. The peoples of the subarctic and the plains had been making snow goggles for centuries. They did not have lenses in the modern sense. Their strength lay in their design. They were carved from a piece of wood, bone, or antler. It was a single strip of material that followed the contours of the face and covered the eyes. It had no large openings, only 2 narrow horizontal slits. These slits worked like a diaphragm in a camera. They sharply reduced the amount of ultraviolet rays entering the eye, while maintaining sufficient field of vision. This allowed the wearer to look at the snow without the risk of getting burned. In addition, this design protected the eyes from the icy wind and fine snowflakes during a blizzard. The glasses fit snugly to the face, creating a barrier. They were often attached to the head with a strap made of rawhide. Each pair was unique. They were cut to fit a specific person so that they sat perfectly on the bridge of the nose and cheekbones without letting light in at the edges. It was a personal and vital piece of equipment. Modern climbers and polar explorers use sunglasses with a high level of protection. But the principle remains the same, to limit the flow of light. In an emergency, anyone can make such glasses from a piece of cardboard or bark. This technique demonstrates a deep understanding of the environment. Indigenous peoples did not fight nature. They observed its challenges and created elegant solutions. They did not treat blindness itself, but prevented its cause. Snow goggles are not just an artifact. They are a survival technology honed over millennia. They prove that sometimes solving a complex problem requires not more technology, but more ingenuity. Winter dwellings were the center of life. For Plains peoples such as the Lakota, this was the tepee, and for the Iroquois, it was the massive longhouse. Both types of dwellings required serious preparation for winter in order to preserve precious heat. Take the tepee, for example. In the fall, the entire community prepared for the cold. The main task was to seal the dwelling from the wind. A high earthen mound was built around the perimeter of the tepee's base, or snow was packed tightly around it. This snow or earthen rampart prevented the icy wind from penetrating under the lower edge of the roof. Combined with the inner canopy we mentioned earlier, this created an almost airtight lower section. Iroquois longhouses were permanent structures made of wood and bark. In winter, they also required insulation. The gaps between the bark slabs were carefully caulked with moss and clay to stop drafts. Inside the house, life was organized around warmth. Sleeping platforms covered with thick skins were raised above the cold earthen floor. This allowed people to sleep in a layer of warm air that rose from the hearths. Managing supplies was of paramount importance. Huge bundles of firewood were harvested in summer and autumn and stored inside or near the house. Having dry firewood was a matter of survival. The long houses also used the principle of heat zones. The central passageway with hearths was the warmest part. The further away from the fire, the colder it was, but these areas were used to store supplies that needed to be kept cool. Living together in a long house, which could accommodate dozens of families, was a hack in itself. The collective warmth of bodies and several fireplaces heated the massive structure much more efficiently than if each family had lived in a separate small house. Today we call this passive heating and microclimate control. For them, it was simply life. They understood that heat was a resource that needed to be produced collectively and stored carefully. Preparing the dwelling for winter was not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. It was a collective effort, where everyone contributed to the overall comfort and safety. Winter did not eliminate the need to obtain food. In fact, hunting in winter was the main source of fresh meat for many groups. However, this required a completely different strategy than summer hunting. For the peoples of the subarctic and northern forests, such as the Cree, deep snow became their main ally. Hunters on snowshoes could move quickly, while their prey, deer or moose, got stuck in deep snowdrifts. The animals quickly became exhausted, struggling to make their way through the snow. Hunters could pursue them for hours without expending much energy until the animal was worn out. It was a hunt of attrition, where technology gave humans a decisive advantage. On the Great Plains, hunting bison in winter was more difficult. Huge herds broke up into small groups. Hunters had to track them in blizzards and cold weather, relying on their knowledge of the terrain and the animals' habits. They used the landscape as an ally. A group of bison could be carefully directed towards a deep ravine or a snow-covered cliff. In conditions of poor visibility and slippery ground, the animals lost their advantage. Hunting in winter required perfect knowledge of tracks. An experienced tracker could determine not only the type of animal from its footprints in the snow, but also how long ago it had passed, whether it was wounded, and even how tired it was. Another technique was the use of camouflage. White cloaks made of skins or fabric allowed hunters on the plains to blend in with the snow, creeping up on their prey to within bowshot range. It was not a chase, but rather a game of chess. Hunters had to think several moves ahead, predicting where the animal would go, where it would look for food or shelter from the wind. Modern hunters still use these techniques. Tracking in the snow, using snowshoes, and waiting patiently are all fundamentals of winter hunting that were established thousands of years ago. Winter hunting was the highest expression of skill and respect for nature. It required not only strength, but also intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of the ecosystem, of which you were only one part. Surviving a harsh winter is not just about warmth and food. The long, dark months, limited space, and constant cold were a severe test of the spirit. Psychological survival was no less important than physical survival. One of the main hacks was social cohesion. Winter was a time when nomadic groups gathered together in sheltered valleys. It was a time for socializing, strengthening bonds, and collective rituals. The Iroquois longhouses or Lakota winter teepees became centers of cultural life. Elders told stories, passing on knowledge and myths to the next generations. These stories ensured that people did not forget who they were and where they came from. Work was another salvation from depression. Winter was not a time of idleness. It was a time to repair equipment, make new clothes, weave baskets, and carve tools. Hands were always busy. Women sewed moccasins and decorated clothes. Men repaired weapons and made new snowshoes. This monotonous but meaningful work structured the days and produced visible results. Games were important not only for entertainment, but also for maintaining physical fitness and social skills. Inside the teepee or longhouse, games of chance with dice were played, developing attentiveness and strategic thinking. Outside, despite the cold, active games were played. The Lakota, for example, played Snow Snake, a competition involving throwing special carved sticks across ice or snow. This required strength and dexterity. Winter ceremonies and rituals helped structure time and gave hope. They were dedicated to renewing the world, giving thanks for surviving the winter and preparing for the coming spring. Modern psychology calls this combating seasonal affective disorder. For indigenous peoples, it was simply life. They understood that the mind needed to be occupied just as the body needed to be warmed. Thus, culture was the main means of survival. Stories, crafts, games, and rituals were all part of a complex system that allowed people not only to survive the winter, but to live it with dignity and meaning. We have looked at just 10 ingenious techniques that allowed Native Americans not only to survive, but to thrive in the harshest winters. From the physics of snowshoes to the psychology of the long night, this knowledge has been honed over millennia. It proves that a deep understanding of nature and ingenuity are often more important than sophisticated technology. Which of these survival techniques do you find most relevant today? What other aspects of indigenous peoples' lives would you like to learn about in future issues? Suggest your topics in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.